If you were with us last week, we were discussing what took place at the United Nations and the WHO as they were pushing forward this pandemic declaration. Now, former Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann was with me last week, and we discussed that 11 nations withheld their support for the declaration for a variety of reasons, which prevented the United Nations from rubber stamping a pandemic response declaration that contained many objectionable terms, including censorship of anything they deemed misinformation, as well as listing universal abortion access. Ultimately, this would cede authority to unelected bureaucrats. What I see as I dig into this more and more is that the World Health Organization really wants to be the vanguard of global governance. Joining me now to discuss this and more is Jim Roguski. He is a member of the Law and Activism Committee at the World Council for Health, and he tracks the World Health Organization and what they're pushing forward with this pandemic accord. Jim, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
You categorized this last week, this meeting at the United Nations, and the failure to get unanimous consent, a defeat for the UN and for the WHO. You even called it a glorious failure. Tell us why.
Well, they were trying to pull off a bit of theater. You know, it was a theatrical production, and I'll try to make it very, very simple. If a committee of people that are members of Congress got together in a room and televised it and said that they had adopted an agreement and led people to believe that it was actually Congress that had adopted that agreement, I think most people would realize that that was a theatrical production that did not reflect reality. So the 11 nations did their homework. They know the rules, and what they saw that was being attempted was not the same as, you know, the actual General Assembly meeting discussing and voting on a declaration that the UN proper then got behind. And so they put a wrench in the works of the propaganda machine, and that hasn't stopped the media from misrepresenting it. You can see headlines that people come away with, oh, the UN adopted this. No, it was a bunch of people in a room that said they agree to it, but they were forced to put a little caveat in their statement that said, well, you know, we're adopting this subject to, at some later date, we'll try to get this before the actual UN General Assembly. So, you know, they were exposed for the shenanigans that they were attempting to, you know, propagate this propaganda.
But Jim, the media really hasn't reported on it. They haven't reported much of this at all. Plus, when you look at the statements coming out of the United Nations, they just kind of sweep all of that under the rug. In fact, I want to play a clip of the Director General, Tedros Ghebreyesus. This was today over in Geneva, making a comment on last week's meeting. Clip 7.
Last week was a historic week for health, with 3 high-level meetings on health issues at the UN General Assembly in New York. Member states approved strong political declarations on pandemic prevention, preparedness and response, universal health coverage, and tuberculosis. All 3 are relevant to the work of this region.
How do you respond to that, Jim?
Well, you know, you can see how they spin a failure. He said member states approved. That leads someone to want to believe that that was some sort of an official, you know, statement, but it's propaganda. What was said was that this is subject to being presented at some future date before the actual United Nations General Assembly. And so, you know, that is misinformation because they don't let people know that, you know, this is coming. And, you know, once you understand how they play the propaganda game, those 11 nations saw it coming and they called it out in advance. And they actually used the word pretend in their letter to the president of the General Assembly.
Pretty well-written letter, a pretty strong letter. So let me just ask you this, Jim. This is my take on what the UN, how they've spun this, how the WHO has spun this. They want everybody to think that, oh, yeah, everybody is for this, therefore you should be for it too.
Exactly. And what I'd like to do is a little bit of what those 11 nations did. Please be aware that next week, October 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, the working group with the WHO's amendments to the international health regulations is scheduled to have meetings where they're going to be discussing some very important issues. Definitions of terms, things like the word vaccine, what does that really mean? There is not a legal definition of vaccine or pandemic or safe or effective. They're going to be talking about the scope of the amendments to the regulations, the principles, things like dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. But most importantly, next week, they're going to be discussing what most people call a vaccine passport, but they refer to as the Global Digital Health Certification Network. Now, they're likely to do all of that in secret. And so what they do is they try to have all of these meetings in secret. And this is the next to the last meeting in regards to the amendments to the international health regulations. People need to know that last year at their World Health Assembly in May of 2022, amendments were adopted. And the deadline to reject those amendments is coming up very rapidly, December 1st. Nobody in the media, nobody in Congress or the Senate, and quite frankly, nobody in any parliamentary body around the world has spoken up, because there is still 2 months left for every nation. And I am praying on a regular basis, I mean this sincerely, that national leaders around the world come to their senses and do what's needed. Just simply write a letter to the WHO rejecting the amendments that were adopted last year. And everyone, I hope, will pay attention to the negotiations that are coming next week for over 300 more amendments. We must speak now or forever, realize that they're doing this.
Live under this global power grab that the WHO and the United Nations is making. Jim, we're out of time, but we'll follow up next week when that meeting takes place, and we're certainly going to prompt people to take action. Jim, thanks so much for joining us. Always great to see you. Appreciate your insight.
Thank you very much for all you do.